Okay, so our last learning objective here in chapter 12 is learning objective 9, where we talk about something called the Phillips curve and how that relates to expansions and inflation. So an idea that was very popular for a long period of time was something called the Phillips curve. So what is the Phillips curve? The Phillips curve is a potential relationship between unemployment and inflation. So I'm going to plot the unemployment rate on the horizontal axis and the inflation rate on the vertical axis. And the Phillips curve was a negative relationship between these two. So it's a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. Or between inflation and employment, if you prefer that. If I wrote it that way, it would be increasing function, but the same idea. So I just kind of draw a couple points here. Points A and B that help us understand that relationship. So at point A, the unemployment rate is 3% and the inflation rate is 5%. So unemployment is relatively low, but inflation is relatively high. And as the unemployment rate would continue to go lower, the inflation rate would continue to go higher. So I move down along the curve this way. The unemployment rate is going up from 3 to 10%, but the inflation rate is going down from 5% to 1%. So there's a negative relationship between those two variables. Now, why this idea is important is that it potentially offers an explanation for using various policies to move the economy from point A to point B. That's one of the main questions, is to think about, can I go from point A to point B? So can policy, I should say, move us from B to A? Right, so let's say I'm in a recession, the unemployment rate is 10%. Or like what we have right now, unemployment rate probably closer to 15%, 20%, something like that. And inflation, let's say, is relatively low. Could I move from there to point A by using policy? And so basically what it's saying is you can get lower unemployment if you're willing to accept higher inflation, or vice versa. If you want lower inflation, you have to accept higher unemployment. All right, so how might that work in our model? So how could I explain this relationship? And on the one hand, it's fairly straightforward to explain. So if I look at our model, especially in an expansion, so I'm going to draw my labor market here. So I have the quantity of labor and the wage, and I have labor supply, and that vertical part is going to be the important aspect here, where I hit the number of potential workers, and I can't hire any more workers beyond that point. And so if I start from down here and I look at what happens in an expansion, labor demand, so here's some employment, here's W1. So I have some, we'll call it unemployment. From here to here is my unemployment. Right? It's kind of the difference between potential workers and the number that are currently working. So just as a rough way, that's how we can kind of think of it, right? So what's going to happen as labor demand starts to increase in an expansion? Employment starts increasing, and eventually we get to this point of, I'll call that N3. Labor demand 3, we're at N2, right? Employment is increasing and unemployment is decreasing. Eventually we hit that natural rate of unemployment. So let's say that's somewhere around 4%, right? So basically, labor force participation is kind of maxed out. Some people are still unemployed because it takes time to find a job. But there we are, right? We're at the number of potential workers. Now, as labor demand continues to increase, so as we have improvements in productivity of workers, labor demand is increasing that wage starts to increase pretty quickly. So the more and more workers I want to hire, if labor supply is fixed, in order for the labor market to be in equilibrium, the wage rate is going to have to increase. The wage starts to go up faster and faster. So as a firm, how do I still make a profit when the wage I have to pay my workers is going up? That implies I'm going to have to charge more and more for my goods. So as labor demand increases, as we start to reach the maximum capacity of our economy for workers who are willing to work at any wage, the wage rate starts to increase faster and faster, and that's going to cause the price of those goods to increase, or the price level to increase, and that is, by definition, our inflation. So it's certainly, you can see how it's feasible that at very low unemployment rates, as the economy continues to expand, we would see an increase in inflation. Now, the other side of it is potentially a little bit harder to explain. Why, as labor demand went down, the price level would decrease, but you can kind of come up with a similar explanation. So that's kind of the main idea, how we could get inflation in an expansion. So in general, the Phillips curve relationship doesn't really exist in the data, especially in the long run. So if I look at the data and I look at unemployment rates and inflation, there's no particular relationship between those two. And there's nothing that seems to show systematically that in expansions the price level does increase, or it tends to decrease or not increase as fast in recessions. So, why was this curve so popular, and why has the sort of myth of this hung around, is really more has to do with ideology, I think. So if you had a particular ideology that promoted either, an activist policy or not, you would really like the idea of a Phillips curve, right? So it would say, well, the unemployment rate is really high right now, but don't worry. The Phillips curve says we can make a trade-off between unemployment and inflation and move our economy back to a good position with some particular policies. And so that was really why the Phillips curve stuck around for so long. And in some sense, at least in popular reports of what the Federal Reserve is doing, the idea of the Phillips curve still sticks around. So you'll hear, and we'll talk more in the next chapter about Federal Reserve policy, but you'll hear news reports say, well, the Fed is worried about inflation. And so they're doing this, and the implication is that they have to accept higher unemployment as a result. Or they're worried about unemployment, and so they're going to potentially increase inflation. And so we'll try to understand the extent to which that's true, but at least we have an idea of what the Phillips curve is, and we've got some understanding of how it might exist, especially in expansions, and some awareness that potentially the data doesn't support this idea in general. So that is the end of Chapter 12. Please have a look at the homework problems. Use these notes to help you on those homework problems, and if you run into issues, please let me know.